TopMedTalk.
Well, hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. We are at Euroanesthesia 2023, the annual meeting of the European Society of Anesthesiology and Intensive Care. I'm Desiree, Chappell, your host, here today with a little treat for a new voice here on TopMedTalk, Andy Cumpstey. Andy, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Desiree.
Yeah, you're filling in for Monty. Big shoes to fill.
I know, big shoes to fill. Yeah, no pressure. Eh?
No pressure at all. Monty is presenting during a session today. So Andy and I are here on the GE Healthcare booth. We just wanted to give a big shout out to GE Healthcare for supporting TopMedTalk. TopMedTalk is free, open access medical education to the world, and we could not do it without our sponsors. So we wanted to thank them. Andy, a great meeting so far?
Fantastic meeting. There's excitement around the whole exhibition hall, isn't there? It's brilliant. Really exciting.
It really is. And the sun is shining outside.
Always sunny up here in Scotland, Desiree. Always sunny up here in Scotland.
Absolutely. Well, in true TopMedTalk fashion, we're having great conversations here at the meeting in the exhibit hall. You can hear lots of the buzz around that Andy was talking about. You'll also be able to hear the barista that is positioned just so well right next to the TopMedTalk pop-up studio. So you're going to hear all those things. So we really are here in person. But I'm just so delighted today to introduce our next guest, Professor Manfred Blobner. Professor, it's so wonderful to meet you. Thank you so much for sitting down with us here on TopMedTalk.
Thank you very much for inviting me for that talk.
Yes. Well, please do tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, since many years, much too long.
A couple.
Anesthesiologist in Munich at Technische University of Munich Medical School. The last years I did some work on big data since we have that big data in anesthesia available for calculations, because I'm very interested in math points. So yeah, I was for about 16 years vice director of the Department of Anesthesiology, and since 5 years I'm doing research as a primary task.
Oh, interesting. So looking at big data points, what part of anesthesia and what data points are you looking at?
So my first interest is actually in data that show us that patients are adequately anesthetized. In former times, we did it always by measuring blood pressure or heart rate or related parameters, but I think that's very indirect. So I'm really interested if we are able on a practical base to do monitoring of depth of anesthesia and depths of neuromuscular block on an actual routine base. That means in every patient.
Yes.
We did it in the department in the time when I was in charge, and we do it again still that's the time. And so we have many data from which we can learn what works well so far and what has to be improved.
Yeah. So, as a nurse anesthetist myself and Andy as an anesthesiologist, accustomed to using different types of technology in the OR for depth of anesthesia?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a whole range of different technologies available, but it'd be interesting to get your opinion on which of those technologies you think we should be using.
Depth of anesthesia can be monitored by, let me say, any processed EEG monitoring. That's the best what we can have. So independently, if you're using the BIS system or the entropy system, which is developed primarily by GE, it gives us a good estimate about depth of anesthesia. It's not the truth itself, so there must be some mistakes also, but it's at least the best what's available. Again, in my department where I'm working, it's absolutely mandatory to use one of these tool systems in a patient who is set on loss of consciousness.
So
there's no way out not to do it.
So it would be for all surgical patients?
Every patient that is anesthetized.
Interesting.
Every patient.
Yeah, regardless of
100% rate
versus inhalation versus...
That, for me, that's not a big difference.
It doesn't matter, yeah.
I'm doing that case of, that kind of, I'm doing 1 day in the week doing anesthesia still, to be in praxis.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what the nurse has prepared.
Yeah.
It's a big difference. So I can't find a difference between inhalation anesthesia or EV, total intravenous, in terms of outcome. That's constructed by whoever. Yeah. So whatever is done, one thing is clear. We must measure depth of anesthesia.
Yeah, interesting. Andy, do you use processed EEG for all
We
patients?
do. Well, in the department I work in, we have some people who are very big advocates of using it. And I've also got some colleagues who are quite cynical about using it. And it's interesting, you mentioned outcome there as TIVA versus volatile anesthesia. But I mean, what's the evidence that we should be using adequate anesthesia monitoring, depth anesthesia monitoring in terms of outcomes? Does it change our outcomes?
That's hard to explain because the study must have been done and it can't be done anymore in the department I'm working because it's a hard you can go for a step wedge model, for example, but not in a department in which people are used to do anesthesia based. When you're using such a entropy or BIS monitor, and we do this since more than 15 years, there is no anesthesiologist that is trained to do it without. So it's an unfair comparison. But what I can tell you, I'm also working in the University of Ulm in the anesthesia department 1 day a week. And they don't do that on a regular basis. And when we did studies, neuromuscular monitoring study, I think we will come to that later. What I saw is when I brought the machine with this depth of anesthesia monitoring for research purposes, and regular anesthesiologists did anesthesia, and we did monitoring for the neuromuscular function. But as I'm also not used to do anesthesia without my brain function monitoring, I saw that they had a high rate of birth suppression. And they were very astonished. And on the other, and so this changed. Simply using that changes the way anesthesia is performed.
Changes
so they noticed
there is no outcome study in my point. But you never will give a drug for controlling blood pressure, but not measuring blood pressure. But anesthesiologists are used to do anesthesia without measuring depth of anesthesia. I can't. It's for me not understandable.
But thinking that blood pressure may be an indication of depth of anesthesia, which is probably that's not the right answer, right?
It's indirect, by the way. It's more indirect than a processed EEG. It's also indirect, but direct. You must ask patient: are you aware or not? That is done. And it's clear. It has many advantages. The first, my point is, you don't do too deep anesthesia.
Right.
Because it's not possible to see on a clinical base if a patient that has a normal blood pressure is in a state of birth suppression. And we know that this is outcome relevant. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, why giving a drug in an inadequate dose?
Yes.
Every drug has effects and side effects. And it's so simply to know that side effects are more likely if you overdose a drug. So what the hell brings us to do anesthesia without measuring depth of anesthesia with the best available system? That's far away from thinking this is ideal. It must be further developed. It must be possible to be paid. If this census costs €20, it's too expensive for a regular hospital. So that funds such a situation, Andy, that you have just described, that some do it, some you get a change in technique when you do it on a regular base. Full stop.
And it's interesting you mentioned cost there as one potential, I'm going to say excuse or reason people choose not to use it, but are there any other potential reasons or disadvantages to using it that people may be concerned about, or any risks to using it at all?
Obviously, we have different systems. One, as a chair in German, you say you have to do it in each patient. It is done. So that's simple. So normally that is today called leadership. I'm not sure if that's leadership, but that's the case in our department. It was a clear message. If your patient is anesthetized, you have to do that. And if you don't do it, you have to have hard arguments. And when starting that, hard arguments came up. But then you have to convince them. But you only have to convince those who are older than 50. The others are doing it simply.
They're already they did it.
Well, that's it. I mean,
training programs.
As you said, I've always been trained. This is how we do it. This is how we use it. But it's interesting that, as you say, that change in practice that's coming through.
That's the point. Is it risk? I have never seen a risk by this depth of anesthesia monitoring. What I saw is definitely that there is a cost risk. And again, a part of speaking with the producer.
Of course.
Yeah. One of the, just to kind of get technical for just a moment, because this is something in my department we're having discussions about using processed EEG. We use it a lot. We do a lot of TIVA. So that was our entry into saying we need to do depth of anesthesia monitoring, at least for these patients. And we do a lot. So there's been adoption of that. But we also are doing multimodal analgesia techniques and incorporating things such as ketamine and MDA receptors agonists. And so how does that affect, and have you seen that have a major effect on how patients are treated using processed EEG?
We use processed EEG also when we are using ketamine. By the way, we do not use it very frequently. Mm-hmm. So again, what I said before we started that, I do not see major differences in the way you're doing anesthesia in terms of outcome.
Yeah.
A little bit more pressure up, a little bit more pressure down, as long as it is in a normal range.
Yeah.
That's important. If you're using sevoflurane or desflurane, it's more an environmental question than a question related to patients. If you do gas anesthesia, whatever, and you do it too deep, then it's a problem. If you don't do it too deep, it's not a problem. If you do TIVA, you must more paralyze the patient. Yes. That's known. There are good studies that show that you have to give more neuromuscular blocking agents. That's also not a problem. If you monitor it, it's clear. You have both things in balance. You can control both things. That's easy. It's more to control what you are doing than the available drugs. Then the drugs are more than ideal.
Yeah. It's another tool in your toolkit. I do use it, and I'm an adopter of that. You spoke about neuromuscular blocking, and I know that's something that you're also passionate about. Tell us a little bit more about, I know that there's been some new guidelines that have been put out by the ASA in America for neuromuscular blockade monitoring and things like that, and there's Sugamidex and other alternative medications to reverse. So let's talk a little bit more about it.
Interesting point. I've done research for my lifetime in that field. I'm very happy that there are guidelines. It's amazing that we had the American and the European at the same moment. The first question is, why do we have it in 2023 and not in 2010?
Good question.
So, a simple answer. In 2010, all the necessary knowledge was on the table. But there is no solution outside recommending Sugamidex on a more frequent base. Everything else would be not based on data. So the community had to answer the question, can we strongly recommend a drug that costs €80 or $1 per patient? And the answer was, no, we can't. It's of such a high economical point that all the recommendations from a clinical point of view can't be completed by the systems. So in Europe, it's now over. MSD will lose the patent rights on the 27th or 29th of July in Europe.
Oh, okay.
So that means on the 1st of August, the drug is available, and it will change doing anesthesia in Europe, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because there's no need to deepen up anesthesia in order to avoid a neuromuscular block. And there are some studies. I'm not completely prepared for that session,
okay.
so I can't tell you.
Yeah, we
so
can
I can tell you the name of the authors. And they showed that introducing neuromuscular monitoring plus Sugamidex or the base, free available base, the blocks became deeper, giving incremental dose of rocuronium becomes later, closer to the end of anesthesia, but the depth of anesthesia is not that deep. If you don't measure depth of anesthesia with an entropy or BIS, then the risk for awareness will increase. And if you give very close to the end of anesthesia a neuromuscular blocking agent, you must give really enough reversal agents. And you must be sure that there is a complete recovery. And you should measure the next 10-15 minutes in order to see a deep deepening the block again. Maybe it's recolorization, or at least it's something kind of rebound. Yeah. And the likelihood for rebound is in clear linear relation to the complete dose of rocuronium, irrespectively if you give Sugammadex.
Of the reversal.
So, we have Sugammadex since 15 years in Europe.
Yeah.
But we don't have enough knowledge about deepening the block, reducing the depth of anesthesia in many, many cases on a regular basis.
Right.
Yeah. So, I think it's very important that neuromuscular blocking, neuromuscular monitoring is also carried out the whole period, not only the last 5 minutes, in order to see how much dose was necessary, to follow the track, to see what, and then give the right dose, and not stop monitoring when the first 90% value is here. That's the most important problem, and especially I've seen it with my friends in US very frequently, that top 90, stop monitoring, even if they do it.
I was just going to ask. Yeah. So I'm assuming, let's talk about monitoring. I'm assuming at your shop in Munich that everyone has neuromuscular monitoring from flash to bang, right? And what type of monitoring are you using, and how is that used?
It's simply dependent on the monitoring system you have. If you have a monitoring system like Philips or GE, I think Mindra also, that have modules for neuromuscular monitoring, you will take that. So in one hospital I'm working on a regular basis, we have a GE monitoring, and there we have the GE module, and that allows us to do electromyography and kinemyography. In the other hospital, they have a Philips monitoring. There you have to use the old TopWatch system, which is integrated as a module. So if this available, you should take that what is available.
So I have the old Twitch monitor.
And you don't measure quantitatively.
No, I know, and that happens in the US quite a bit.
I'm very worried about that.
Yes, yeah.
I'm very, very worried about that.
Yeah, and we're, how does one build a case for us to talk to our hospital partners to say,
great question. That's what I was going to ask as well.
Yeah, to build a case for how do we integrate and bring in neuro monitoring?
Again, from my personal experience, it's simply a leadership decision.
Yeah.
So we decided that using neuromuscular blocking agent is mandatory to be monitored quantitatively. And it was a cheap solution in GE because we only had to buy
a new module.
The module. And the module, irrespectively, if it costs 2,000 or 10,000 euro, it's an invention for one time, and you can use it 10 years. Right. So on regular basis, we use simply ECG electrodes to stimulate. Yeah. And as the KMG is much easier to apply, this is a 95% use, and only those who are interested in use the real, very much better EMG system. It's the same in all. Yeah. So that's a single question. You must pay for the modules, and that's it.
Yeah.
The question is different. The EMG is better than all mechanic systems.
Yes.
But it's only better if it is used correctly. And to apply 5 or 4 electrodes is a hard job for training. Tough. So the normal anesthetists are doing always mistakes in that case.
Yes.
So the solution is the single-use device that includes all, maybe it's a next important step, like this given now in the market. But they will have between 15 and 20 euro for device. And now we are again in the price question. I think in UK it's similar to Germany. 15 euro per case increases the budget by €500,000 in a normal hospital.
Yeah,
and the €500,000 must be discussed. So.
And on top of that, there's the training cost as well, as you mentioned. It's not just buying the module, is it?
How is that going to help improve outcomes? What are we most concerned about if we're not doing neural blockade monitoring and not using depth of anesthesia monitors?
You simply do not the best kind of anesthesia if you don't do that.
Yeah.
And the question is, can the best way to do anesthesia improve outcome? Based on data of the last 20 years and continuous monitoring and PDMS during the last 10 years, it's hard to define the effect on better anesthesia on outcome. I think one of the major problems in the hospital I'm talking about, we had neuromuscular monitoring and we had depth of anesthesia monitoring, as mentioned many times in our talk. So I don't have a comparator.
Yeah.
And doing it in that way, I can't see major effects of anesthesia on outcome.
Yes.
What we see is that long phases of deep blood pressure have outcome effects.
Yes.
But not outcome related to mortality or need of intensive care. It's more like Clavin-Dindo class 2.
Yes.
These problems are less frequent if you take care for a higher blood pressure, which, by the way, is easier if you don't do too deep anesthesia.
If you don't, exactly.
But I do not have comparators.
I know.
But a hospital that is well organized does have that.
And we've talked a lot about that on TopMedTalk, about using depth of anesthesia to actually help as a tool for hemodynamic management, better hemodynamic management. You know, not having someone so deep, avoiding hypotension, things like that. I think too, when it comes to reversal, you know, inadequate reversal, inadequate recovery from neuromuscular blockade, it's a real problem. We know that.
Yes,
we know that
that's
a problem.
real problem. Yes, but I was responsible for the Popular study.
Yeah.
And Popular was 25,000 patients in Europe in 2016. We published it in Lancet Respiratory Medicine. And unfortunately, those who take part, actually, we could not show that doing anesthesia in the right way improves outcome, in pulmonary outcome. And finally, the most important effect in the model, in the statistical model, was the hospital. And so I'm coming back to what I said just now. A well-organized hospital takes care of measuring depth of anesthesia, depth of neuromuscular block, recovery, doses the drugs on a routine base in an adequate range, have a well-organized PACU, has a well-organized preparation. And so all these parts are part of a bundle.
Yes.
And then the outcome is well.
And then we know that it is.
That's
the incremental changes all have a
It's really hard to find out if one of these many factors is able to improve anesthesia by itself alone.
Which is the silver bullet. Professor, thank you so much for sitting down with us on TopMedTalk. We really do appreciate it. Great conversation. Hopefully we can have you back again sometime soon. So
it was a pleasure speaking with you, Andy.
Thank you so much. All right. And thank you for listening to TopMedTalk. You know, you can find us at TopMedTalk.com. You can find great conversations like this on our social media platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. We are there. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.